All right, people still trickling in. I'm Christian Rose. I'm at Stanford University. I'm going to be moderating this talk, so feel free to send any questions into the chat. But super excited this morning for this session. Does looking at art make us better physicians? With Kamna Ballara and Nathan Irvin. Super excited. Take it away, guys.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining in and being here to discuss how looking at art can enhance our capabilities as emergency physicians. So I'm Kamna Balhar. I'm one of the APDs at Hopkins, and I co-direct our Health Humanities at Hopkins EM initiative. I also just completed the Harvard Macy Institute's Art Museum-based Education in Health Professions Fellowship, which was a really neat experience. And I'm joined by my fantastic colleague, Nathan Irvin, who amongst his many roles at Hopkins and his expertise in social EM is also my colleague and co-director in Health Humanities at Hopkins EM. So let's get started. We hope you'll see by the end of this talk that the role of art in medical training is not just that it's fun, but that it's compelling and a thought-provoking pedagogical tool, and that it's evidence-based. So we are, of course, clearly convinced, but you don't have to take our word for it. Major organizations in health professions education think so too. The arts and humanities were a major point of focus in this year and the past year for the Association of American Medical Colleges, the AAMC. And they actually commissioned scoping reviews of the existing evidence along with expert panels and concluded that they strongly encourage the integration of the arts and humanities across the continuum of medical education. And this includes medical students, so undergraduate medical education, residents, fellows, all the way up to continuing medical education and physicians in practice. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine also issued a report a couple of years ago on the integration of the arts and humanities, and similarly concluded that there is sufficient evidence to urge both the support and the evaluation of courses and programs that integrate the arts and humanities with medicine in higher education. And just to give you an idea of the bulk of work that's out there, of course, of varying methodological strength, is that there is actually a broad base of evidence. In fact, the scoping review that was funded by the AAMC that just got published, they found over 700 articles describing arts and humanities initiatives in health professions education. So there's really a lot out there. We will be covering the evidence, but what we really want is for people to be able to experience this and see what they might be able to take home to their own institutions and see what's relevant to them. So our objectives today would be to get you all to experience a museum-based exercise, of course, recognizing that we're all here over Zoom, to explore the literature around art-based education and clinical excellence, to briefly just discover the ways in which art is being used across the continuum of medical training, specifically in EM, to engage in a visual thinking strategies session, some more about that when we get to it. And finally, to also be able to list some tips and tricks for implementation at your own institutions or programs. So we are going to jump into an individual sort of reflection-based exercise, and we encourage you to share your thoughts in the chat as you go through this exercise. Of course, normally, as I said, we would be in the museum and kind of being in the galleries together and exploring art in person, but we have adapted this to the virtual environment. So for this activity, we are going to be putting a link in the chat, and this link will take you to sort of like a virtual mini museum gallery that we've put together. We would like for you to think about what first drew you to emergency medicine and to choose a work of art from that virtual gallery in the link that speaks to or resonates with your initial motivation, interest, or inspiration. After selecting your work of art, just sit with it for a couple of minutes to maybe notice what emotions or thoughts or observations come to the surface for you. And please share information about the image you chose and your personal response to the work of art and why you chose it in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. When we come back to the group in about 5 minutes, we'd also love to hear from any of you that are willing to share about the image you chose so we can put the image up and kind of hear from you about why you picked it. I think we'll have time for about 5 people or so to share. So please, as you're going through the images and choosing your image, if you'd like to speak with the rest of the group, just raise your hand. So it's 12:05. We'll regroup just right before 12:10. And I hope you enjoy looking at the mini gallery. And just keep putting stuff in the chat as and when you'd like to. I think we have just a couple minutes more. I see a couple things coming into the chat. Please feel free to put your thoughts in there as we wrap up as well. All right. So we're coming up towards 12:10, so we'll regroup back to the group. I'm seeing some messages come into the chat. Thank you all so much for sharing. Hope you're enjoying what everyone else is finding in these images. Is there anyone who would like to kind of verbally share what they found, and we can look at your image together? If so, just put your virtual hand up. All right. Oh, yes, we have a hand raiser. Hello.
I want to know about number 6. Is that a man who was committing suicide?
I think that's the beauty of it, is that we don't know. What makes you think that he may be committing suicide?
If that's not photoshopped, he's fallen. He, there's no way he could maintain that position. And it's, he's going to be at our emergency department as a trauma resuscitation.
Yeah, that's very valid. That's a very valid interpretation, and your reasoning based on the evidence that you're putting together, which is, if this is not photoshopped, the position he's in is sort of not really compatible with a good outcome. But maybe he's flying. Maybe some takers may see him as flying potentially, but that's the magic of it, is there's so many different interpretations. Thank you so much. Michael?
Michael Lehman, yeah.
I liked number 11 because I think, like EM, every time I looked at it, no, the next one, the green one, yeah. Each time I looked at it for a second, third time, I would see a different shape or a different object in it. And I thought that's one of the things that I love about EM, right? It's like, you find something new in the details with every encounter. And the first time I looked at this, I thought it looked like flowers, and then I saw rainbows, and then hand grenades, and then a chromosome. I mean, like you can find a million different things here, and that's like the ED. So that one spoke to my emergency medicine interest.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Linda?
Mine was number 12. So I danced for a long time, and it was something that made me extraordinarily happy. And I went into emergency medicine because I just utterly loved being in the emergency department. It made me feel like a joy I didn't feel in other services. And I looked at this photo and I thought, oh my gosh, this is how I want to feel again about emergency medicine, right? Like the woman in the front has utterly thrown her entire body and being into it. And perhaps she's modeling or teaching those behind. And, that's part of how I identify myself. And it's beautiful, right? I think emergency medicine is an art, right? And just like all these other arts that we talk about. And this really just spoke to me as to what I really want to see myself as a physician, someone who has joy and love and the ability to show that to other people, and perhaps to role model it for others as well.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. if there's anyone else who'd like to share, I think we have time for one more comment. I see, and just feel free to put your hand up, but I just want to draw attention to what people have shared in the chat. So thank you all for sharing your valuable insights and responses. We've had people mention slide number 2 and sort of the emotional pull of the woman bathing the child. And then we already talked about the sort of the ambiguity and the fear that's there in slide 6. And I think, like Michael, Cindy also chose slide 11 about the concepts of mosaics and making something beautiful and creating order from chaos. And then I see Linda's comments, Lauren's comments about the exhausted superhero, which seems to reflect perhaps many of our mental states at this time. I think others were drawn to this image of Grand Central Station, and looks like 6 as well for Logan. Seemed like one of his motivations for EM was wanting to move towards impending disaster and address it rather than shying away. The journey of EM, the thought of Grand Central Station, where this is confluence of humanity, that EM is a great equalizer, a life of service for some. So thank you all so much for sharing. And it's really fascinating to see for some people how the same image maybe brought up sort of so many different thoughts and emotions. So really appreciate it. So we will now move on. So just briefly, this was actually a modified version of what's called the Personal Responses Tour, which has been trialed in medical education. And it's a great way to evoke conversation, minimal faculty preparation, and each learner can bring to it whatever they want to bring to it. So there's no real, sort of pre-knowledge required. Each person's given a prompt. In our case, it was the same for everyone, but it could really be different for each person. And you're asked to sort of walk individually around the gallery and identify an image that speaks to your prompt. And then you kind of go through the gallery as a group with each person kind of stopping in front of the image they chose. So it's called the Personal Responses Tour. And you can make it, something, find an image that embodies happiness or find an image a loved one would enjoy. But you can also make it much more literally relevant to clinical and medical care. Find an image your mentor in medicine would enjoy, or think of the last patient you saw and find an image that reminds you of them. So it's a really fantastic way to explore the ways we approach maybe the same image, to explore our biases, and to share our perspectives. So now we'll turn to exploring the literature about art-based education in the medical setting. So observation and the ability to interpret what we observe is, of course, a core tenet of diagnostic excellence and situational awareness in the ED. And art confers visual literacy, which is the ability to interpret and find meaning in an image or what you see. In fact, neurobiological research shows that the most powerfully engaging works of art trigger brain regions in the frontal cortex. So not just what's involved in introspective thought, but also nearby regions that are involved in more outward matter. In a controlled observational study of approximately 50 medical students at Harvard, they found that following an art-based curriculum, class participants increased their total mean number of observations compared to controls and had increased sophistications in their descriptions of both artistic and clinical imagery. In another ophthalmology-based study, 36 first-year medical students were randomized into art training and controlled groups. And in this randomized control study, students in the art training group were taught by professional art educators over 6 sessions, and they completed pre and post testing in which they described works of art, retinal pathology images, and external photographs of eye diseases. And observational skills improved significantly in the training group compared with the control group. And in the subgroup analyses, art training improved clinical observational skills as assessed by the retinal fundus photographs and the external photographs of eye disease. Emergency physicians also routinely face undifferentiated patients and make decisions in high-stake environments with limited information under uncertain circumstances. That's kind of the core of our job. And so this sort of set of negative or positive psychological responses, whether they're cognitive, emotional, or behavioral, that are provoked by sort of this conscious awareness of uncertainty and not knowing, that's called tolerance of ambiguity. And individuals who are more tolerant of ambiguity will be more likely to persevere when confronting complex problems, more likely to stay open-minded, and increase the probability of discovering a novel solution. So a systematic review of 67 studies on the tolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty in medicine found that intolerance of ambiguity, so being uncomfortable with that, was associated with a fear of making mistakes, psychological distress, decreased resilience, as well as important patient harms or outcomes, increased testing, diagnostic inaccuracy, and higher admission rates. So clearly it's a core skill or attribute in EM, but how do we teach this? How do we teach someone to be more comfortable with ambiguity? So in looking at art, there's often a lack of closure, a lack of definitive answers or interpretations, and many art-based exercises ask of participants that they sit with that uncertainty and with that discomfort and kind of face it as they're looking at the work of art. So in one study of 32 interprofessional health professions learners, med students, PT students, pharmacy students, they participated in a series of museum-based sessions that compared pre and post-intervention measures and found that not only did students increase the amount of time they looked at art and the number of observations they made of art as well as patient images, but that they also significantly increased their tolerance of ambiguity as measured by a modified version of Budner's tolerance of ambiguity scale. And this is something that has been demonstrated in other studies with both residents and medical students, as well as people outside the medical sphere. Kind of pivoting a bit, thinking about art or aesthetic thought is very rich and complex. And the psychologist Abigail Howson, who's been studying aesthetic thought since the early 70s, has found it to encompass the cognition that educators refer to as critical and creative thinking. And engaging and looking at art has subsequent impacts on observation, speculation, and reasoning on the basis of evidence. And these skills have actually been demonstrated to be transferable to other settings, including medicine. And this sort of creative and critical out-of-the-box thinking may be key to diagnostic excellence, developing solutions to complex problems, as well as maintaining intellectual curiosity. Art can also generate environments to challenge assumptions and examine one's implicit biases, and has been shown to have an impact on how people perceive patients or talk about bias in the medical setting. So Rebecca Volker described in JAMA how an art-based activity actually led a group of medical students to change how they viewed patients with dementia, for instance. Amy Zaidan and colleagues described how they use art and archaeology at a local museum to get residents to talk about bias. They used something called deep description, which pushes the observer to think critically about each small detail of an object with the purpose of understanding the intent of the creator or how the object represents different traditions or communities. Importantly, this technique encourages the participant to separate objective findings from subjective evaluations. And so they found it was a great way to get people talking about implicit bias. Bonnie Marr and Jay Baruch at Brown described museum educator and physician facilitator led sessions that they held at the RISD Museum of Art, where they used works of art as the basis for guided discussions to allow participants to explore how their own experiences shaped the way in which they perceived, interpreted, and responded to patients' subjective experiences of pain. So a lot of rich ground there as well. Art is also a means to reflect on professional identity. There's actually a really neat description of an intervention by Mark Stevens where they had medical students make masks to think about their process of going through medical school. And in another study over the course of 4 years with a cohort of over 40 medical students by Gouda and his colleagues, they found that students reflecting through the lens of art actually enhance not only their observational capabilities or bias awareness, but also their ability to reflect. So it's a great way to sort of pause and think about the different traumas or transitions we face in medical training and in the practice of medicine itself. Empathetic core, another core milestone, empathetic care, another core milestone of medical practice and emergency medicine is associated with greater patient satisfaction, improved physician well-being, and decreased burnout. And fMRI and neurobiology-based studies have demonstrated that when you view art, there's a tendency of the observer to attempt to place themselves into the artwork. So this is called embodied cognition, and there's like mirror neurons in the brain that actually turn elements such as action, movement, and energy that you see in art into actual emotions that the viewer feels. And so it starts with looking at a piece of art, and the more the piece is analyzed, the more there's a tendency for the viewer to place themselves within the scene and actually feel the quality of the works, which leads to the development of empathy through inner imitation. So it's hardly surprising then that there are actually multiple studies of art-based education in medical education, which allow participants to develop skills in taking and sharing perspectives, create openness to different viewpoints, and subsequently positively impact empathy as measured by both subjective measures and validated scales. Another really neat way in which art has been used is as a means to engage with patients in their communities. So for instance, these are our residents on a mural tour of Baltimore. as a way to more meaningfully engage with surrounding communities that patients come from and to spark conversations on important topics such as the built environment or other structural forces that impact health. Art also functions as what's called a third thing, and we'll get into this in a moment, but it's a great way to talk about challenging topics in medicine, such as ethical dilemmas, equity in care, social justice, just to name a few. So a third thing is essentially a work of art or some other kind of object or image that's a reflective trigger or conversational mediator that creates a safe environment for sharing perspectives. In research in this amongst medical trainees and professionals, educators describe how sometimes if you directly confront a deep truth, it can be painful or frightening. And third things open an avenue for indirection. So a participant may move from exploring a third thing to his or her own story or truth. But if their revelations start to get too personal and painful, they can just pivot right back to talking about the third thing. And metaphors accessed through images allow for greater observation and exploration of deeply held assumptions. And art as a third thing has been shown to deepen relationships and clarify group values when you've got a group of people, group of physicians, group of residents, group of healthcare staff working together. And finally, using art to talk about difficult topics allows us to flatten traditional hierarchies. So the AHRQ commissioned a conference on patient safety where they used art as a third thing, and they got groups of physicians, healthcare staff, other professionals, and patients and families who'd suffered adverse events to get together and talk about that experience. And they talked about it as equals without the traditional hierarchies that are usually in those relationships. So everyone kind of developed a common language and felt empowered to contribute. So as for like a concrete example of this, as part of the ongoing conversation in our residency program on systemic racism, we used art as a means to start an important conversation and create a space of safety to have that conversation. So during one of our sessions, we presented this image to them without any context or background and simply asked, what's going on in this picture? That allowed people to bring their own interpretations and experiences when looking at this image and led to a really powerful discussion on a number of themes that were brought up by our residents and faculty, including medicine's own complicity in structural racism. It also succeeded in making our residents and faculty feel comfortable with being uncomfortable. This painting is actually titled Emergency Room by the artist Robert Colescott because he wanted to show how the ER is a vivid allegory for the whole country in that we only seem to deal with social issues on an emergency basis. And we found that by looking at this image, things came up from our residents and faculty that were invisible or unseen. People shared their own experiences with discrimination or racism in the medical environment. And we actually ended up starting a forum for people to share their stories after looking at this image that was suggested by our residents, where they sort of submitted anonymous submissions to kind of keep this conversation going. So while the evidence that's out there for the implementation of art in med-ed is not all, level 1 RCTs, and there may be methodologically lacking, we do believe that there's definitely enough out there that establishes this as a worthwhile endeavor in education and as a subject for more rigorous study. The AAMCs concluded that there's a unique but yet still unrealized role for the arts in medical education. And they also found that arts and humanities serve 4 epistemic functions in medical education, such as mastering specific knowledge or skills, building relationships with patients and colleagues, creating capacity for resilience and reflection, and social advocacy via critical reflection on the environment around us. And this is a great framework for anyone interested in applying arts to their curricula. There's tons of art-based education at the medical school level. There's actually over 60 partnerships between local museums and medical schools that are out there. And these include electives, integrated curricula. Sometimes they're within the hospital, the classroom, at museums themselves. And some of these are actually fairly intensive. Like some of these are 11 sessions or 18 sessions. So pretty integrated. A lot less at the GME level, which is not surprising. But they similarly are very diverse in their setting, in their partnership, in the fact that you have interprofessional participants such as nurses or pharmacy residents joining them. And they go beyond just visual art to film and dance as well, and also incorporate different modalities, including patient care scenarios and simulation. Very limited in CME as well. We did host a 4-session CME series at our institution. And because we ended up doing it virtually, it was CME at the Art Museum. We hosted approximately 100 participants from the US, Canada, Greece, Spain, Portugal, the UK. So the interest is definitely there. There just aren't a ton of programs. So now I'll turn it over to Nate to give us a bit more of a deep dive into what art-based med ed has looked like in practice within our program, just to give you some more concrete examples.
Well, as an example of how art has been incorporated into GME, we want to highlight our program, which is called H3EM, which is Health Humanities at Hopkins Emergency Medicine. It's a department-wide initiative that has multiple components, one of which is a longitudinal curriculum that's actually integrated into our weekly residency didactics. The curriculum focuses on topics as wide-ranging as social determinants of health, anti-racism, and visual art has been a key component of that curriculum. We've used museum-based activities where we actually took our residents to the Baltimore Museum of Art, as well as visits to murals around the hospital, as Kamna showed earlier. In creating this part of the curriculum, we've partnered with museum educators, as well as artists through interactive activities and talks, and really try to figure out how we can engage lots of people from the art community in different ways. Art can be applied for so many versatile uses, and the works of art that we were going to show you now are ones that we've actually used in our own curriculum. We've used works of art in sessions to help contextualize social determinants of health, to discuss the importance of context, as well as the value of getting the bigger picture and thinking about what we see versus what we can't see when we take care of patients. We've used the power of images in making us reflect and reconsider in order to challenge the stigma and bias around addiction. We've used art as a conduit to get our residents into the community and to the built environment around the hospital to get a better understanding of the social context in which our patients live. We've looked at complex and ambiguous works of art in order to get residents to reflect on health literacy, jargon, and the clarity of language in patient communication. And as we mentioned, we've used art to spark conversation on social justice, as well as to examine injustice and inequity in medicine's past so that we can sort of mind the past and learn from it moving forward. And have also applied art as a means toward creating a culture of collaboration and openness within our residency. And so the responses from our residents in formal feedback, focus groups, and surveys has been extraordinarily powerful. And we'd like to just give you a sort of a sampling of some of the sort of what we've learned that the impact of the humanities have had on our residents. These illustrative quotes are from evaluations of our sessions from across different years in training, as well as 2 different residency programs where we've sort of piloted some of these activities. One of the things that comes to mind is the idea of reflecting on biases. And we find that our residents felt that it allowed me to reflect on what others feel or go through in regards to their access to care. It also allowed me to pause and think about what biases we all have, myself included, even if they are unconscious. For example, we make assumptions about people just based on the colors and pains. So what do we do in real life? I definitely pause and think more in my everyday life now. So the idea that they're not only reflecting on bias, they're actually interrupting that bias and making different decisions in real time based upon some of the stuff that they're learning in these sessions. They also felt like it helped encourage vulnerability. One of the illustrative quotes in this areas show that I loved how open and vulnerable everyone was in sharing their interpretations and experiences. And I think this really helps to validate humanity and helps to build a collective culture of openness with one another. Our residents also felt that team building was an important thing that they learned out of doing these activities, as illustrated by this quote where it said, it was really refreshing to use the creative side of our brains while also learning more about one another. And so you're able to build community, you're able to help your residency to grow and help people become stronger team members and supporters of one another. Additionally, it helps with observation skills. I think it helped me to consider the whole picture before analyzing one detail, right? So the idea that our residents can see both the forest and the trees and be able to kind of take those different viewpoints when they need to is critical for training an emergency physician. Additionally, it highlights the sort of concept of ambiguity, perspectives, and reflection taking. And one of the residents stated, I learned that I have more thoughts about art than I realized, and there's no wrong answer. I felt more comfortable discussing once I realized this. I also enjoyed hearing everyone's thoughts And it taught me a lot about the way that I react to other perspectives. So the ability to be a leader where you can share other perspectives, hear other perspectives, and be able to sort of take all that in is critical for the sort of leadership roles that we as emergency physicians have and want to instill into our learners. And additionally, it helps to empower our learners. It gives them a voice. One of the residents stated that knowing that my opinions and thoughts and interpretations are valid and having the strength to share, right? And so that same confidence they're building in sharing about these images, they can then take and adapt to their role as emergency physicians. And so we think that these skills have been critical to the development of the learners that we've been working with.
Thank you, Nate. We would now like to have you all engage in a visual thinking strategies session. So a little bit more about what VTS is. It actually has its origins in museum education at the MoMA. And it's been studied, used, and refined over 30 years with all levels of learners from pre-K through adults. And in the past decade or so, also with medical learners. So it's a teaching method that encourages open discussion of art with a structured series of dialogues. And so we're now going to have an opportunity to experience it in action. So just some ground rules before we start. So we are looking at this work of art together and talking about it. So it's not about expertise in art or art history or knowing about who painted this or what it's about. It's simply the observations, perspectives, and the experiences that each of you will bring to the table. Everyone is invited to participate. No one is obligated to participate. Since this is an abbreviated session, we may not get to everyone who wishes to contribute, but we're excited to hear from as many of you as possible. This is a learning experience for all of us. So, we are just facilitating this conversation and learning along with you. So I'll be using the VTS approach. So again, structured approach to asking questions, where I'll have a bit of dialogue with each person who speaks before Nate calls on the next person who would like to contribute. So here is the image that we're going to be looking at. And we'll just take a couple minutes to look at like a less than a minute to look at the picture, and then we'll get started on talking about it. All right, so what's going on in this picture? Just virtually raise your hand and Nate will call on you. Anyone? Remember, no right or wrong answers. Just tell us what you see. Tell us what you think is going on.
Looks like Linda Reagan's raised her hand.
I was hesitant to raise my hand because there are so many things going on here that I'm not sure. I wasn't sure where to focus. So I'll say where I was drawn initially. So it is like a bird man or woman artist who seems like they're there's like a violin in the place of where their heart is, and they're using, it almost looks like the strings from the violin is either, I guess my initial thought was like, they're actually using the strings to create or build these little birds that, I don't know, then are hit by this light through a triangle on the side. And even though it looks like they're being created by paper and whatever this weird little machine thing is on the side, then they become real. And, my initial thought was like, oh my gosh, it's because they're using this string that's coming out of the artist's heart. So that was my initial thought when I looked at it.
Thank you so much, Linda. So I'm hearing you say that this is like a bird person of some variety who is potentially using this instrument that's taking the place of the heart to maybe animate the drawings that they're making into real objects. So you're saying that this is a bird person potentially. What makes you say that? What do you see that makes you say that?
Well, the initial shape of the head sort of looked like a bird shaped to me, almost like an alien shaped bird, but there was also human features in the face, you know, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, but then their whole body looks like it's feathers in the torso that go down, you know, and the legs. And so it just looked like there was a mixture of features that looked bird-like, but also human-like at the same time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. What more can we find?
So next we have Colleen, followed by Tim Vaughn.
Hi, thanks. So when I saw this person, I thought of them as more of a scientist. And the kind of way that science and art used to, before we had computers and people drew pictures, and adding color to the paintings, the drawings to try to understand science and chemistry. And this is almost like someone from somewhere else going through that same journey. So it reminded me a lot of like the pictures of like 1500s, 1600s scientists, artists like Leonardo da Vinci, but almost like a different take, like a dream or an alien doing the same thing.
Thank you, Colleen. So I'm hearing you say that maybe less of an artist, but more of a scientist, and sort of hearkening back to potentially a different time period. I'm curious to see what do you see that makes you say that this is that is reminiscent to you of those like 15th or 16th century images?
I mean, the colors being muted, like this is more of a candle lit room than a fluorescent light, and there's no coverings on the windows so that it could, you know, that it's open to the air on the outside, and it doesn't look like anything electronic is there.
Great, thank you. So I'm hearing you say like maybe the lighting, the way the building is constructed, and the absence of anything plugged into a wall, for instance, gives you a sense of the time of this image. Great, thank you so much. What more can we find?
So we're gonna have Tim next.
I think I had the same initial reaction to Linda. There's a lot going on, but I think there are three elements that stuck out to me, which is the apparatus to the left of the painting that's kind of connected outside the round window, the magnifying glass, the triangular magnifying glass with the light beams, and then I also kind of focused on the violin. And so those three together, I think the apparatus looks like it's distilling paint into a palette, and that may be coming from like the atmosphere or the sky of some sort. And the magnifying glass is focusing light. So these are kind of light and air, kind of more natural and scientific methods of creation, but what is being created, which is I assume the small birds, for it to come to life, it needs quite literally or figuratively in this, the heart string, right? The violin placed in the center of the heart, and the string is connected or being used as the apparatus to make these things come alive. So it can't just exist with just the scientific elements, but it needs kind of that humanistic element to create something meaningful and alive and that can go off and do its own thing. So those are the things that kind of stuck out to me that were interesting.
Thank you so much, Tim, for your observation. So I'm hearing you pull in and notice some things that we hadn't yet discussed. The fact that there's paint dripping onto this palette, and that you're relating that it may be coming from the outside, and the outside element that's producing it is air. That there's a function here for light as well. And then you point out that the sort of the heartstring is what's needed as a final step to sort of animate this image to life. What do you see that makes you say that the light is bringing the image to, or that the light is participating in the image?
Yeah, so it looks like in the distance out that first window, it's either maybe the moon or star that's coming in. You can see the beam as it hits the interestingly shaped triangular magnifying glass, and it looks like that is being dispersed into the bird that's still kind of on the page in the lower part of the actual drawing. Whereas on the right hand isn't yet finished the tail, the wings and the head of the bird are starting to like come up. So it seems like it was part of the process of making that creation. Those beams as they spread out are being utilized to generate what is kind of in the process of becoming alive.
Great, thank you so much. So I think I hear you sort of highlighting this dynamic interplay between finished and unfinished and how those beams of light are sort of being refracted into different elements of the image. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more comment. What more can we find?
It looks like there's a comment in the chat by Christian who state that it seems in many ways like the owl, which represents wisdom, is studying other members of the bird family.
Christian, did you want to elaborate on that to us?
Happy to. I just think that there's an interesting element to me on the medical side that seems very self-reflective of some version of a type of bird, either making, creating, bringing to life, or studying other members of that family. And to me, it represents some way of transition or this transformation too, possibly, of either the thing becoming that which it's studying, so maybe it was human, moving into the bird or vice versa, but this funny state of flux and transition. And I think it's interesting as a choice to have the some level of bird observing or creating others, which just reminds me of what we do. We have this role as physicians where we try to use perspective. We try to both help, heal, observe, listen, view, be patient, be doctor. So it feels very, it feels very apropos to me.
Great, thank you so much, Christian. So I'm hearing you sort of highlight the multiplicity of roles that maybe we play, or that this individual is playing as well. And in addition to what's already been said, so for instance, Linda said that this was maybe an artist capturing their image. Colleen mentioned the element of science. Tim mentioned the element of sort of animating something to life. I think you brought up something new that we hadn't yet touched upon, which is the concept of studying or observing. So what do you see that makes you say that this owl figure is studying those birds?
I feel that it's to me, the paints or the colors, I just sort of immediately saw sort of painting and like either outlining, almost like the Audubon pieces, like almost this life scale detail of the bird that exists on the paper and either comes off of it or not. And then the use of the spectrum and the types of light, I feel like, reminds me of spectrography, or and then there's the the like tubes on the side here. So just to me, almost it feels like a laboratory, but also feels like the person looking with very specifically different layers of light, which are like the scientific things we did in organic chemistry back in the day. I don't know. It felt very similar, so it jumped out to me in that way.
Sure, thank you so much. So in the same way that perhaps the setting reminded Colleen of like a different time period, you're also seeing in this setting some elements of a lab. And maybe for Tim, the light was more animating them to some extent, and you're maybe interpreting the light as allowing this individual to see different angles or get a better study of this object that they're looking at. Fantastic. So we are running short on time, but that was really fun. I really enjoyed hearing everybody's insights. In just a minute or two, is there anyone who would like to share, even if you didn't, speak up, just hearing this or listening to other people's observations or observing yourself, if there's anything in particular you felt like this activity asked of you, or how it might be relevant to you personally or professionally?
It looks like Bob raised his hand.
Go ahead.
I was really moved by what others saw in this that I did. I saw kind of academic process going on, and it wasn't until other people pointed out that she was creating birds, and the amount of life and creativity in the room. And it's like, wow, what am I missing? Very moving.
Thank you. I think you brought up a great point. And it's not that any one person is missing anything. I think the fun of this is like the different lenses that everybody brings, and the different ways in which we interpret it based upon what our eyes are drawn to, or what other things in our past may have like sort of influenced the way we see things. So it's really a neat way to make new revelations, in a sense. As we're gathering more questions, I will just race ahead through just a couple other things, just some tips for implementation if you would like to take this home with you. This is doable and feasible by anyone at any institution in any program. Again, no art expertise required. We may not all feel comfortable with facilitating these discussions, but this is a really great idea to think outside the box in terms of collaborators and opportunities for training. So the simplest thing is go to the museum and see one of the museum educators lead a session to kind of get an idea of what this might look like for you. Or if you want more formal training, there are opportunities like the Harvard Macy Fellowship, and you can even become a trained facilitator in visual thinking strategies. There are courses out there for that as well. When you're looking for images or themes, your local museums, galleries, murals are a great place to start. The Literature, Arts, and Medicine database sponsored by NYU, as well as the Bedside Education in the Art of Medicine, or BEAM app, are both fantastic annotated repositories of works of art that are geared towards medical education and health professionals. And RX Museum is another initiative that's out of Penn Medicine, where they send you like a weekly work of art and a reflection on it. That's a great place to look for themes as well. There's always the arts and reflection sections of our scientific and medical journals, like Academic Medicine or the AMA Journal of Ethics. And I'd really encourage you to also think about like the Journal of Medical Humanities or other medical or health humanities journals that are out there to look for ideas. Seek out interdisciplinary partners. The museum educator is your friend. These two museum educators are fantastic people who actually wrote an article, tips for collaborating with an art museum for medical educators. And you can think about your local colleges or universities, who's there that you could partner with, and people in other departments who may share your interests. Then there's a question of buy-in. I think there's enough national momentum for major organizations that we cited earlier, including the AAMC and NASM, and both organizations have published reports that are really helpful to cite or have on hand when you're having these conversations. And much of what we discussed today aligns really well with the new EM milestones, and much of what art hits upon are core skills in EM that can't really be taught through traditional methods, and art's a great way to do that. When it comes to your learners or your target audience, the value of the arts in medicine and EM often gets slotted into the wellness bucket, and learners are often very wary of another compulsory like wellness initiative, right? But as you've seen, the value of art and EM is much broader than just that. So we have to make time for it and show that to our learners and colleagues. So the next time you give a lecture, maybe build in 10 minutes of art observation. Start to acclimate learners or the audience to the concept of looking at art and normalize it as a teaching tool. We had our share of recalcitrant learners who by the end of the year were some of our biggest advocates. So it's just important to expose, and get feedback from the learners to see what you can tailor and adapt to their specific needs. And finally, in terms of logistics, our residents really pushed us in their feedback and said, we don't want this to be a one-off. We don't want it to be like a random evening where we do it on the side. They wanted it to be integrated and longitudinal into the residency curriculum, which we are lucky enough to be at a program where it is. We recognize, of course, this is not feasible everywhere. So certainly in the beginning, make room for it wherever you can. As you can see, you can do it virtually. Be careful with the chat function. Depending on what you're doing, it can distract or kind of take away from that closed looking. But in some cases, it's a great way to get people comfortable talking if they're not comfortable talking out loud. You can do it in the classroom. You can get outside the hospital and do it. And you can do it for 5 people. And at some national conferences, they've done it for audiences of 200. So it's really adaptable. And don't forget to set ground rules so that people know that they don't have to be experts in art and that this is about respecting each other's perspectives. And so with that, we will wrap up and take any questions. And we'd be so happy to hear from you. If you have questions or resources we can share with you, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us.
So Kamala, there was one question in the chat about how we go about selecting the different types of art that we use for sessions.
Sure. So I think some of that was on a previous slide where I said where some of our sources are. I think it depends. If you're just simply using art to get people to observe or think about things and there's no overarching theme or agenda in mind, I think you could really mine from the works of art that have inspired you. Or collaborate with museum educators if there's a specific theme you have in mind or specific curricular objective or goal. The museum educators are a great way to start to help them sort of have you identify what's within the local museum that you could use, and they can even make suggestions for what's outside local museums. And I think the more and more you get exposed to what's out there, I think the more comfort I can say that I gained with choosing works of art to include in our work.
And I think the other thing to acknowledge is that you have no idea how people are going to make meaning out of the piece of art that you put up. And so we've been blown away by the different observations or the different takeaways that people have come up with that artwork that we thought was representative of one thing, and people come up with completely different interpretations of it. And so just be mindful of that, and there's beauty in that.
Well, thank you guys again for this amazing talk. Kamna and Nathan, this is fantastic. A great reminder of how to observe and how much we're already doing, and a fun way, an important way to be able to take this into the other parts of our lives. The visual study doesn't, begin and end in the ED, but is a thing we can learn to be better at in every part of our lives. Thank you so much for the presentation. If there aren't any other questions, I think we're just over time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you. I know that there were a couple of comments in the chat that we didn't have a chance to get to, but thank you for sharing those as well.
Thank you, everybody, for being here and sharing the space.